What if I told you that the most reliable rod in your boat, the one you've likely spent hundreds of dollars on, is actively preventing you from catching fish right now? We're talking about that all-purpose rod, that trusty 7-foot medium-heavy fast-action stick you use for everything from spinnerbaits to Texas rigs. And today I'm going to show you why, specifically in March, that jack of all trades is a master of none and is probably the reason your finesse baits are getting ignored by lethargic post-winter bass. The secret isn't in the lure, it's in what you're not feeling through your hands. And by the end of this, you'll understand why. Do you have one rod you use for almost everything? Let me know in the comments right now what it is. I bet I can guess the specs. March is a tricky month. The water is cold, the fish are slow, and the bite can be incredibly subtle. It's the time for finesse. For years, we've been taught to find a good, versatile rod. The one-rod-does-it-all philosophy. It saves money. It simplifies things. You grab your medium heavy and you feel ready for anything the lake throws at you. We've all done it. We've all bought into this idea because, for a lot of the year, it kind of works. You can throw a crankbait, a jig, a spinnerbait, and you get by. It's the comfortable, familiar choice we make without even thinking. This habit is born from convenience and the way fishing gear has been marketed to us for decades. The perfect all-around base rod, the ads say. But what they don't tell you is that all-around often means not great at anything specific, especially when things get tough. We stick with it because it's what we know, and admitting our favorite tool is flawed feels, well, it feels wrong. But sometimes the old way isn't the best way, especially when the conditions demand a specialist. Let's start with a mental reset, a real shift in how we think about fishing in March versus, say, July. In the heat of summer, fishing is often a reaction sport. The water is warm, the baits are aggressive, their metabolisms are fired up. You can burn a spinnerbait, rip a lipless crankbait, or punch a heavy jig into thick cover. The bites are often violent, unmistakable. You get that classic thump that nearly yanks the rod out of your hands. Your all-purpose medium-heavy rod is perfect for this. It's built for that power and speed. But March is a different beast entirely. Imagine the lake is just waking up from a long winter nap. The water temperature is still hovering in the 40s or low 50s. The baits are lethargic. They aren't going to chase down a fast-moving bait. They're conserving energy. A bite isn't a violent explosion. It's a subtle, quiet whisper. They might just softly inhale your bait and sit there. Using a summer-style power approach in this scenario is like shouting in a library. You're not speaking the right language, and you're completely missing the quiet conversations happening right under the surface. So, what does finesse actually mean? It's a word we throw around a lot, but it's more than just using small baits. Finesse is a mindset. It's about subtlety, patience, and a deep connection to what your lure is doing 50 feet away under the water. It's slowing everything down. It means presenting a small, non-threatening meal to a fish that isn't actively hunting. Think about a tiny Ned rig just sitting on the bottom, or a drop-shot worm quivering in place. The success of these techniques depends entirely on your ability to detect the slightest change. Is the bait suddenly weightless? Does it feel a little mushy or heavy? Did the line just twitch? These are the signals of a finesse bite. An all-purpose rod is designed for loud, clear signals. It's a blunt instrument in a situation that calls for a surgeon's scalpel. Finesse fishing is a game of inches and ounces, and your equipment has to be tuned in to that delicate frequency. It's about listening for a whisper, not waiting for a shout, and that is a fundamental difference in approach. Now, let's get into the DNA of your all-purpose rod. The first component is power, and it's usually rated medium-heavy. What does that actually mean? Rod power refers to the blank's resistance to bending under load. A medium-heavy rod has a lot of backbone. It's designed for heavy lifting. Think about its intended purpose: driving a big 5/0 worm hook through a plastic craw and into the tough jaw of a largemouth. It's built to pull a 3-pound bass out of thick lily pads or away from a gnarly boat dock. That stiffness, that backbone, is its greatest strength in those situations. It gives you the leverage and the raw power to control a strong fish in heavy cover. It's a power tool. When you set the hook, you are transferring a massive amount of energy down the line to move that fish. This is exactly what you want when you're flipping a jig or working a Carolina rig with a heavy weight. But as we'll see, that incredible strength becomes its biggest weakness when the game changes to finesse. Here is the core problem with all that power in a finesse situation. Remember, a march base might not crush your bait. It might just swim up and gently inhale it, barely moving. This is often called a pressure bite. There is no thump. The only signal you get is a slight increase in weight, like you've snagged a wet leaf. Your medium-heavy rod, with its powerful, stiff backbone, is completely numb to this. It's over-engineered for the task. Imagine trying to feel a feather land on your hand while you're holding a 10-pound dumbbell. The rod simply doesn't have the sensitivity in its deeper sections to transmit that subtle pressure change. You'll drag the bait right out of the fish's mouth without ever knowing it was there. You'll think you just bumped a rock or some mud. On the water, this looks like a beautiful, slow retrieve that produces nothing. You're getting bites, you just can't feel them. That powerful tool you love is effectively deafening you to the subtle language of the early spring bass. The second part of your rod's DNA is its action. Most all-purpose rods are labeled fast action. This means that only the top quarter or 1/3 of the rod blank bends when you put pressure on it. The rest of the rod, down to the handle, remains very stiff. This design is fantastic for a few things. First, it allows for incredibly quick and powerful hook sets. Since only the tip moves, all the energy you put into the hook set is transferred directly down the line almost instantly. It's like a spring-loaded trigger. Second, it's great for imparting quick twitching actions on baits like jerk baits or for popping a jig off the bottom. That fast, responsive tip gives you precise control over those aggressive lure movements. Again, think about summer fishing. This is perfect for reaction strikes where you need to drive a hook home immediately and with authority. The fast action tip is the aiming device, and the medium-heavy backbone is the cannon behind it. It's a design born from the need for speed and power, which, as we've established, are not the words we associate with march finesse fishing. So, let's look at the problem with that fast action in a finesse context. When a lethargic bass mouths a small shaky head with a tiny fine wire hook, a powerful hook set from a fast action rod can be disastrous. There's no give. That instant, sharp transfer of energy can easily rip that small hook right out of the fish's mouth before it has a chance to properly seat. It's too much, too soon. Furthermore, that stiff blank doesn't load up properly when you're just feeling for a pressure bite. A softer, more moderate action rod will begin to bend or load under that subtle pressure, giving you both a visual and tactile cue that something has changed. Your fast action rod stays rigid, telling you nothing. You are essentially fishing blind and deaf. You are waiting for a signal that is too loud for the fish to even make. It's a complete mismatch. You end up either missing the bite entirely or pulling the bait away from the fish on the hook set. It's a frustrating cycle that makes you think the fish just aren't biting, when in reality, your gear is failing you at the most critical moment. Now we have to talk about sensitivity, because this is where the great lie of the all-purpose rod lives. We've been told for years that a stiffer, high-modulus graphite rod is always more sensitive. And that's true, but only for a certain kind of sensitivity. A stiff rod is exceptional at transmitting sharp, high-frequency vibrations. That's the thump of a jig bite, the chatter of a crankbait, or the feeling of dragging a Carolina rig over a gravel bottom. It's great at telegraphing hard-edged information, but that's not the only kind of sensitivity. For finesse fishing, you need to detect soft, low-frequency information like pressure, weight, and slack. This is where the stiff rod fails miserably. It's like having a sound system with amazing tweeters for the high notes but no subwoofers for the bass. You're only getting part of the sonic picture. It transmits the taps and thumps beautifully, but it completely filters out the mush and the weight of a true finesse bite. True sensitivity is about feeling everything, not just the loud stuff. Your sensitive, all-purpose rod is likely lying to you about what's really going on down there. Let's focus on one specific type of bite you are absolutely missing, the mush bite. Picture this. You are slowly dragging a small tube or a Ned rig across a soft bottom. The water is cold. A bass, not wanting to move much, simply flares its gills and inhales the bait. It doesn't swim off. It just sits there, holding the bait in its mouth. To you, on the other end of the line, there is no tick, no tap, no thump. The only change is that the bait suddenly feels heavy, spongy, mushy. It's as if you've dragged it into a patch of thick algae or a clump of dead leaves. With a stiff, medium-heavy rod, your brain and your hands are programmed to interpret this as a minor snag. Your instinct is to give it a little pop to free it. In doing so, you snatch the lure right out of the fish's mouth. The fish spits the hook, and you reel in, thinking you just cleared some gunk off your bait. You had a fish on and never, ever knew it. This single scenario probably happens dozens of times a day to anglers using the wrong equipment in early spring. It is the most common and most undetectable type of finesse bite. Here's another classic finesse bite your all-purpose rod is hiding from you, the slackline bite. This one is especially common with baits like a wacky rig senko or a drop shot. As the bait is falling or sitting still, a bass will often pick it up and swim toward you or to the side. What happens to your line? It goes slack. There's no pull, no thump, no pressure at all. In fact, it's the complete absence of pressure. Your stiff, fast-action rod tip, which was slightly bent from the weight of the lure, will suddenly straighten out. That is your bite indicator. But with a heavy rod designed to handle a half-ounce jig, the weight of a 1/8 ounce drop shot weight is barely enough to put any bend in the tip to begin with. The change is so minimal that it's virtually invisible. You're staring at your line, waiting for it to jump. But the most important signal was a subtle relaxation of the rod tip that you couldn't even see. A proper finesse rod with a softer tip will have a noticeable bend even with a light lure, making that slackening effect much more obvious. You're missing fish because your rod can't even tell you when the line goes limp. Let's put this on the water with a real-world example. Imagine it's a calm, cold March morning. You're fishing a rocky point where you know pre-spawn base should be staging. You have your trusty 7-foot 3-inch medium-heavy rod, and you tie on a little Ned rig. You cast it out. As you slowly drag it back, you feel every pebble and rock on the bottom. Tap, scrape, tick. The rod is transmitting that hard information perfectly. You feel confident. Then, you pull it over a small rock, and for a second, you feel nothing. You assume the bait is falling on the other side. Then you feel a mushy weight. Ugh, moss, you think, and you give the rod a sharp pop to clean it. What you didn't know is that a 2-pound smallmouth had picked up that rig as it fell. The nothing you felt was the fish holding the bait, and the mush was its body weight. The pop you gave the rod pulled it right from its mouth. Now imagine your buddy next to you has a dedicated medium-light finesse rod. He makes the same cast. He feels the rocks too, but when that fish picks it up, his softer rod tip loads up. It just bends down a little. He doesn't feel a thump, he sees the bite. He reels down and just leans into the fish, and the fight is on. Same spot, same lure, different outcome, all because of the rod. Let's even take a step back and talk about the simple act of casting. Finesse fishing requires light lures. We're talking about a 1/16 ounce shaky head, a 1/8 ounce Ned rig, or a weightless fluke. Your medium-heavy rod is designed to efficiently load and cast lures in the 3/8 to 1 ounce range. That's its sweet spot. When you try to cast a tiny, lightweight bait with it, the rod blank can't load properly. There isn't enough weight to create that spring effect. What happens? Your casts are short, inaccurate, and often end up in a frustrating tumble. You have to work much harder, almost whipping the rod, to get any kind of distance. This drastically reduces your efficiency and your ability to place the bait precisely where you want it, like next to a specific rock or stump. You lose the ability to make delicate, quiet presentations. Instead of a silent entry, your bait splashes down. In the clear, calm water of early spring, that can be enough to spook a wary bass. The very first step of the process, the cast itself, is compromised by using a tool that is too powerful for the payload. So if the all-purpose rod is the problem, what is the solution? The answer is to embrace specialization. You need the right tool for the job. This is where a dedicated finesse rod comes into play. You don't need to break the bank and buy a $400 high-end model. Many companies make excellent, affordable, finesse-specific rods. What you're looking for are different specs. Instead of medium-heavy power, you should be looking for medium-light or even light power. Instead of fast action, you might look for moderate fast or even moderate action. These aren't just arbitrary words on the label. They represent a completely different design philosophy. A finesse rod is built from the ground up to cast light lures, protect light line, keep small hooks pinned, and most importantly, to transmit the subtle, nuanced information that heavier rods simply filter out. It's not a weaker rod, it's a more articulate rod. It's designed for communication, not just for brute force. Making this one addition to your arsenal can open up a whole new world of fishing that you were previously locked out of. Let's dig deeper into finesse rod power. When we say medium light, we're describing a blank that bends much more easily and deeper into its length than a medium heavy. This has several massive advantages in a finesse situation. First, during the fight, that softer blank acts as a giant shock absorber. When a bass makes a sudden run or thrashes its head at the boat, the rod gives and flexes, protecting your light line from breaking. A stiff medium-heavy rod has very little give, putting all that strain directly on your line and knots, which is why you often get breakoffs. Second, that forgiving power rating is crucial for keeping small, fine wire hooks pinned. With a stiff rod, it's easy to put too much pressure on the fish and literally tear the small hook out of its mouth. The softer medium-light rod maintains steady, gentle pressure, ensuring the hook stays right where it needs to be. It allows the fish to fight without giving it the rigid leverage it needs to throw the hook. It turns a chaotic battle into a more controlled engagement. Now let's couple that with finesse rod action. A moderate fast action means that the rod bends further down the blank, maybe through the top half of its length. This is a huge benefit for casting. That deeper bend allows the rod to load up more efficiently with a lightweight lure, acting like a catapult to sling it out there with minimal effort. Your casting distance and accuracy will improve dramatically, but the real magic happens on the bite. As we discussed, a moderate action allows the rod to load up on a pressure bite. A fish inhales the bait, and you see the tip and midsection of the rod begin to arc. It's a visual cue that happens before you even process the feeling in your hands. This also gives the fish an extra split second to get the bait fully in its mouth before it feels unnatural resistance. With a fast-action rod, the fish feels that stiff backbone instantly and is more likely to spit the bait out before you can even react. The more moderate action is a more forgiving, more communicative, and ultimately more effective system for subtle presentations. This leads us to a key concept, the parabolic bend. This is what you see in rods with lighter power and more moderate actions. When the rod loads up, it bends in a smooth, continuous curve that can go well into the bottom half of the blank, almost like a parabola. This is the opposite of a fast-action rod that bends only at the very tip. This parabolic bend is your best friend in finesse fishing. Not only does it help with casting and fighting the fish, but it is also an incredible bite indicator. You can be fishing a drop shot, holding your line semi-taut, and just watch the rod tip. A bite won't be a sharp peck. Instead, the entire end of the rod will just slowly start to bend and load up. You are literally seeing the weight of the fish being applied to the blank. This visual signal is often far more reliable than waiting to feel a bite through the handle, especially on windy days when your line has a bow in it. You learn to trust your eyes as much as your hands, and that's a skill that a stiff, all-purpose rod will never teach you. Let's apply this to another classic finesse technique, the drop shot. You're out on a deep point. Your graph is showing fish suspended 10 feet off the bottom in 30 feet of water. This is a perfect drop shot scenario. With your medium-heavy, fast-action rod, you drop your rig down. The heavy rod barely registers the 1/4 ounce weight. You try to hold it still, but any slight movement of your hand or the boat causes the stiff rod to drag the weight across the bottom. You can't effectively shake the bait in place without moving the whole setup. Now, switch to a medium-light, moderate-fast action rod. You drop down. The softer tip has a visible bend from the weight. Now, you can gently shake your wrist, and only the flexible tip of the rod will dance, imparting a subtle, quivering action to the worm, while the weight stays perfectly still on the bottom. When a bass bites, that soft tip will just load up and pull down. There's no guesswork. You're not dragging the rig away from the fish. You're presenting the bait more naturally, and you're able to detect the bite with absolute clarity. It's simply the correct tool for the job. Your line choice can make this whole problem even worse. Many anglers today, myself included, love using braided line for its strength and sensitivity. So, You spool up your medium-heavy, fast-action rod with 30-pound braid and tie on a fluorocarbon leader. You think you've created the ultimate sensitive setup, but what you've actually created is a system with zero forgiveness. You have a stiff rod with no give, paired with a braided line that has virtually zero stretch. This is a recipe for disaster in finesse fishing. Every tiny movement of your hand is exaggerated. Every head shake from the fish is a violent shock to the system. On the hook set, the force is so immediate and jarring that you're practically guaranteed to rip that tiny number 2 hook right out of the fish's mouth. It's like trying to perform surgery with a hammer and a crowbar. A proper finesse setup balances the equation. A lighter power rod with some give is paired with the no-stretch line, or you use a full spool of fluorocarbon, which has some stretch, on a slightly stiffer rod. Your all-purpose braid setup is often the worst possible combination for this style of fishing. Ultimately, this all comes down to a mental shift. It's about moving away from the idea that one tool can do everything well. You wouldn't use a framing hammer to hang a small picture frame, and you wouldn't use a screwdriver to drive a nail. It's about acknowledging that fishing is a game of nuance and that different situations require different specialized tools. This isn't about being a gearhead or needing to own 20 different rods. It's about owning maybe 2 or 3 that serve very different purposes. Your medium-heavy all-purpose rod is still a fantastic tool for power fishing. It's your jig rod, your Texas rig rod, your spinnerbait rod. But you also need a dedicated finesse rod, one that's designed for light line, small baits, and subtle bites. Once you make that mental shift from being a generalist to a specialist, your approach to fishing will change. You'll start looking at the conditions of the day, water temp, clarity, wind, and you'll consciously choose the right tool for that specific job, rather than just grabbing what's familiar. Now I know there's someone watching this right now, gripping their favorite all-purpose rod, thinking, "This guy is full of it. I can feel everything with this rod. I hear it all the time." But I want to challenge that belief. It's likely a form of confirmation bias. You remember all the solid thump bites you felt, and you assume that's all there is to feel. The problem is, you have no idea what you're not feeling. You can't know what you're missing. You've never been able to compare it side by side with a tool that's actually designed to hear those whispers. It's like listening to music on a cheap transistor radio your whole life. You think you're hearing the whole song, but then someone hands you a pair of high-fidelity headphones. Suddenly you hear background vocals, bass lines, and subtle instruments you never knew existed. The song is completely different. That's the exact experience of switching from an all-purpose rod to a true finesse rod for early spring fishing. You'll start detecting bites you never knew were happening, and you'll realize you've been missing half the music all these years. So what is the ultimate payoff for making this change? It's simple. More fish in the boat and way less frustration on the water. It's about turning those brutal, confidence-crushing days in March into some of the most rewarding outings of the year. When you're equipped with the right tool, you approach the water with a new sense of confidence. You're no longer guessing if that was a bite or the bottom. You know. You're making more effective casts, presenting your bait more naturally, and detecting a much higher percentage of the bites you get. You're landing more of the fish you hook because your equipment is working with you, not against you. Instead of coming home and saying, "The fish just had lockjaw today," you'll come home with stories of how you had to slow down and listen carefully to figure out a subtle bite. It transforms you from a passive participant hoping for a bite into an active detective, using a finely tuned instrument to solve the puzzle of the early spring bass. So, let's bring it all home. That workhorse rod, the one you've relied on for years, isn't a bad rod. It's just the wrong rod for the specific demanding conditions of early spring. We've talked about how its power and fast action, which are assets in the summer, become liabilities in March. They mask the subtle bites, they make casting light lures a chore, and they can even cause you to lose the fish you do manage to hook. The biggest takeaway here, the real aha moment, is this. You might not be having a bad fishing day. You might just be using a tool that's deaf to the conversation the fish are trying to have with you. The fish are biting. You're just not feeling them. The problem isn't the spot or the lure or your skill. It's the piece of graphite and cork in your hand. Understanding this completely reframes your approach. You stop blaming the fish and start evaluating your equipment as a communication device. It makes you realize that sensitivity isn't just about feeling a thump. It's about detecting pressure, slack, and movement. It's the difference between guessing and knowing. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this deep dive. If this gave you something to think about, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content that challenges the old way of doing things. I really want to know what you think. Is your all-purpose rod sacred, or are you now looking at it with a little suspicion? Let me know in the comments below. We'll see you on the water.